Good evening and welcome to another episode of From the Stacks, the live stream program of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We, uh, we are going to have a really fun time tonight. We have as our special guest Dr. Patrick Michaels, a PhD climatologist, former professor of environmental science at the University of Virginia, one of the really top climatologists around the United States, and an old friend of mine. He's been a tremendous resource for me for a long, long time, and just very much appreciated his work. Before we step into that, we're going to just give me just a moment to tell you a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We are a network of just under 70 evangelical Christian scholars, roughly a third natural scientists, including some of the world's top climate scientists, roughly a third economists, specializing either in environmental economics or developmental economics, and also a good many of them in energy economics. And then roughly a third theologians, philosophers, ethicists, people like myself, all working together to promote and to educate the public and policymakers regarding three things simultaneously and interwoven. Biblical earth stewardship, what we call godly dominion, working together to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. Economic development for the poor around the world. What is it that lifts whole societies out of poverty into prosperity, not just isolated individuals or families? And we see those to be things like private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, the rule of law, and access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And unfortunately, because much of the environmental movement opposes those principles and that sort of energy, much of it is very harmful to the poor around the world. And so we find ourselves needing to be in a sort of a constructive critique attitude toward much environmentalism. Or as my wife likes to tell people, we're trying to save the planet from the people who are trying to save the planet. And then finally, we're delighted and committed to sharing the good news of salvation by the forgiveness of our sins when we place our trust in Jesus Christ, who was indeed the Son of God, the incarnate Logos, or Word of God, very God of very God, who became man and bore our sins on the cross, that we, by faith, might be forgiven, might be declared righteous in God's sight, and reconciled to him despite our own sins, our own failures to live up to his commands. This is the most wonderful message we can imagine for anybody. So we try to tie all three of those things together. And tonight we're going to be focusing particularly on climate change and on climate and energy policy, particularly how there are various legal obstacles to the Biden administration's climate policy. And Dr. Michaels has written a very good article about that. One last thing before we jump into that, I want to mention to you that this month, our special offer as a gift of thanks when people donate literally any amount, 100% tax deductible, to the Cornwall Alliance and ask for it, is this book, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth, by my friend Jim Hollingsworth. Jim is a scientist with a varied background and brings great insights to the subject. And the cool thing about this book is that each one of its 48 chapters runs only, typically 2 or 3, a few of them 4 pages. They're all very clearly, concisely, and simply written so that anybody with, say, a 10th grade education and above can understand them. This is a great way to get quick, simple, persuasive answers to many of the arguments set forth by people who are convinced that man-made global warming is dangerous to the point of catastrophe and that we ought to be spending trillions of dollars trying to stop it. So to request your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, just write in promo code 21-06, that's 21-06, or the title, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. Be sure to include the whole title because we have some other products that are also titled Climate Change plus something else. So, without further ado, let's bring in our guest, Dr. Pat Michaels. And Pat, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Please tell us just a bit about your own background, your work at the University of Virginia as the Virginia State climatologist. Perhaps go into the controversy that led to your leaving that position, your former work with the Cato Institute, and now you're with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So,
well, first of all, let me say it's really great to be on your show. Been looking forward to this.
Well, thank you.
I grew up in northern Illinois on a farm, and got very interested in meteorology and climate as a young kid, and I detoured through a biology major, which was also very interesting. And then I wound up August 16th, 1969, on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, right on the east shore of Biloxi Bay, which is where Hurricane Camille came through, a Category 5 storm, and we were pretty close to the water. And I realized I should go back to my weather days and decided to go back into climate science. Since then, I went to University of Virginia for 30 years, or I taught at UVA for 30 years as a research faculty, and was state climatologist, president of the State Climatologists Association, for what that's worth. And I've always been fascinated with not just atmospheric science, but the whole process of science, and the pressures that are put on scientists to keep on producing research and funds and grants, and how that interferes with the development of knowledge, because we don't say the things we want to say because we're afraid that we'll lose some position or some funding or something like that. It happens all the time, and what it's doing, it's creating a biased canon of knowledge, if you will. The referee literature, we consider the canon of knowledge, and if people aren't working on certain things because they think bad things might happen, well, that canon is going to become polluted and is going to be deflected in one direction, which may not really reflect the truth. Or some funding or some. Say again?
So I'm afraid I lost you for a moment there, Pat. My fault.
Sorry.
Doing some weird technical stuff here. Okay. So where did you leave off? You had not gotten to the University of Virginia yet.
Okay. Well, I did my PhD on how the shape of the atmosphere, which varies from year to year, can be reflected in the shape of the agriculture sphere, mainly the food system in North America. And that got me a position at the University of Virginia out of graduate school. I was really surprised that happened, because nowadays, or even back then, you had to usually have a couple years postdoc before you get on the faculty. And I watched the university change over 30 years that I was there, from an institution that I think prided itself on tolerance and free speech to an institution that seemed to inhibit free speech. It was very disturbing to watch that evolution. I know I'm not the only person who's seen it, and that it's rampant across academia around the world, but it was very disappointing.
Yeah, but in all of that time, you really did an awful lot of work in climatology. How many books on particularly climate change have you written or edited? I know I've read probably at least 6, 7, maybe 8 of them.
I think there are 9. Depending upon how you count one that is, what do you say, a lengthy spoof of a federal government document called the Second National Climate Assessment. But yeah, I've enjoyed writing those things, except, every time you finish a book, you say, I'm never going to do this again. And sure enough, a year later, you're back at it. It's weird.
Well, I've been one of the people grateful that you have kept going back at it, because you've provided
Well,
really
thank you.
good ammunition, updated ammunition over and over again as the scientific understanding of climate change, of humanity's role in that, has expanded over the years. Just because some of your and our critics would call you a, let's see, a climate denier, a science denier, a climate change denier, uh, maybe a troglodyte and a Nazi thrown in there as well. Uh, what's your actual belief about
Well, I think
human-induced climate
that's
change?
just silly name calling, Cal. And anybody who's read any substantial amount of what I've written knows that I think the climate changes naturally, and it changes in part due to human influence. It obviously hasn't done that for all that long. That's never really the question. The question is, how does it change and how much does it change? If putting carbon dioxide in the air preferentially warmed the winter as opposed to the summer, would that be such a bad thing? Well, it turns out it does preferentially warm the winter, and the colder the air is, the more it warms. That's not so bad. If the surface temperature on average was going to go up, say, 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, in the course of a few decades, that probably wouldn't be too good because water expands and you'd have sea level rise problems. But it's not doing that. The temperature rise has generally been far beneath what's predicted by these computer models, and I think is behaving in a way that we are being told by the Earth what the future is going to be. The warming that started in the late 1970s is a constant rate of warming. It's not an increasing rate. Anybody that says, "Oh, the world is warming at an increasing rate," hey, that's not the science. It's supposed to be a constant rate, and it is a constant rate, and it's a low constant rate. So that's quite reassuring. And again, it's mostly in the winter and in the cold temperatures. There's
Yeah,
some in the
yeah.
summer, but not that much. If there was that much in the summer, one of the things you would see would be high temperature, all-time high temperature records dropping like flies. But you don't. You see low temperature, warm low temperature records being set, low temperatures, but not high temperatures.
Which is a really cool thing, because as I read in one of your edited volumes on this stuff, quite a long while ago, I think it was probably around, maybe 2001, 2002, there was a chapter in there on how global warming affects heat waves and cold snaps. And one
Yeah,
of the things that the author there pointed out was that cold snaps kill on average about 10 times as many people per day as heat waves do. So even if you had as much increase in heat waves as you had in had decrease in cold snaps, you'd wind up reducing uh, heat and cold mortality to the tune of about 90%, which would be a nice thing.
yeah.
And more recently, I've read that newer estimates are now saying that, well, the cold snaps might kill as many as 15 or even 20 times as many people per day as the heat waves, based on some more recent research. So that's pretty good news.
Yeah, there's also a natural experiment that's being run with or without us putting carbon dioxide in the air. That is that our cities get warmer than the surrounding
Yeah,
countryside because of the bricks and the buildings and and the uneven surface impedes the flow of air, so they don't cool off at night, and then they get hotter during the day. In fact, in the United States, these urban heat islands, the biggest one that I know of, by the way, is right here in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to say that's the
is
waste
that
heat
because
from
of
all the money
politicians?
changing hands. But
I thought it was because of all the hot air that comes out of politicians' mouths.
there's that. There's that too. There's that there. But you would be able to see heat-related mortality increasing if that were much of an issue. But you know what? The weird thing about this, which when you think about it isn't so shocking, is the more heat waves a city sees, the fewer people die because they adapt. And we always hear, well, excess heat affects the young and the elderly. Well, two of the hottest cities in the United States are Tampa and Phoenix. And they don't have any heat-related mortality to speak of because they're adapted to it. Oddly enough, the city that has the coldest summers of all the big cities in the U.S., which is Seattle, is the only one where heat-related mortality is increasing. And all the others, it's declining. And, it's because big death tragedies in urban areas are very noticed by the public. And the political system that's in charge usually takes a lot of heat, pardon the expression for it. The great heat wave in Chicago in the mid-1990s killed about 700 people in one weekend. And there was a big hue and cry. A few years later, there was a heat wave of very similar magnitude and hardly killed anyone because people had adapted. And, the political process realized, hey, we need to have cooling shelters, particularly in Chicago on the south side, where there's not very much air conditioning. There's a lot of brick buildings. So they adapted. And that's what's been happening really around the world. As our cities grow, heat-related mortality declines.
Yeah, one of the things that I remember from grade school, in fact, I think it was early grade school, being taught about the difference between human beings and all the other animals, and of course plants and whatnot, is that human beings are really amazingly good at adapting. They actually change their environment around them to their own betterment. So if they're having a bunch of heat waves, by golly, they get air conditioning. And suddenly heat is no longer a problem.
We saw this happen in France in 2003, I believe it was. There was a very impressive heat wave in France. And I think over 10,000 excess deaths occurred over a relatively short period of time. And, the French thought air conditioning was a crass American invention. Well, that changed after that heat wave. And the next time there was a big heat wave, which was 3 years later, I believe, or so, there was hardly any excess death because people had gone to Carrefour, which is the European equivalent of Walmart, and gotten air conditioners and put them in the rooms. Most of the people in the 2003 heat wave that died were elderly, and it was in August when their children were all on vacation at the beach. And so there was no one to take care of them. And so now they all have air conditioners and we don't have this problem.
Yeah.
But that's adaptation. That's what humans do.
Yeah. I do want us to get to your article, New Biden Climate Policies May Face Strong Legal Headwinds, recently published in Real Clear Energy, which is a wonderful website. But before we do that, I want to kind of turn the heat wave and adaptation thing in a different direction. Adaptation can be costly. Air conditioners are expensive. And so, if you've got a highly developed economy like France, well, you can afford to do that. If you have a very poor economy like most of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and Latin America, you can't afford to do that. But there's a different thing that is hitting even people in advanced economies, and that is the adoption by governments of policies forcing a rapid transition away from coal, oil, natural gas as primary energy sources, especially for electricity, coal and natural gas, to wind and solar, which are much more expensive to the actual end user consumer. People will talk about so-called levelized cost of energy, and they'll show graphs showing that, oh yeah, we can get wind and solar down below coal and natural gas. Yeah, only if you don't count all the subsidies that they get from governments. Scores of times more subsidies to them per unit of energy produced than to fossil fuels. But one of the, I think, really tragic things that came of all of this was that, for instance, from the period, I believe it was 2007 to 2012, when Great Britain was doing a rapid transition away from coal to wind and solar, especially wind, because Britain just doesn't get an awful lot of sun,
No.
for their electricity rates skyrocketed, more than doubled over that period. And as a result, as was reported by the British government itself, excess premature winter deaths more than doubled every single year over that period. They went from an average prior to that period of about 12,000 or so excess premature winter deaths in Great Britain to a new average of anywhere from 36 to 42,000 excess premature deaths per year. And they attributed it all to what they called energy poverty, which was basically when people have to spend more than 10% of their income just on heating, mostly in Britain, right, or cooling other places that don't get that get hotter than Britain. If people have to spend more than 10% of their income just on heating or cooling, they call that energy poverty. Because what happens then is they don't have adequate money left for food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and the like. And so consequently, a lot of them reduce the amount of energy that they consume. And that means they don't heat their homes adequately in the winter. And when real cold fronts do come through, some of them literally freeze to death. And so, we're looking there at the difference between the mortality rates of cold snaps versus heat waves, but we're also looking at the difference between those who still have enough money to adapt, like the French getting their air conditioners, and those who don't, like the energy poor Britons who couldn't heat their homes enough. Give me your thoughts on that, Pat. I just think it's a horrible lesson to have to learn from history.
It's really sad, and it's not clear that the folks, or at least the politicians in the UK, have learned their lesson. They have a huge campaign called Net Zero, and one of the things that's on the table is everybody has to get rid of their fossil fuel fired boilers within 10 years and substitute out electricity, assuming the electricity is produced by something other than fossil fuel, which is a very large assumption, by the way. But this is going to entail huge expenditures. I've seen estimates around £20,000 per household, single expense, and everybody who has a fossil fuel powered heating system is going to have to switch it out. I guarantee you there's going to be energy poverty as a result of that, and there'll probably be a bunch of excess deaths because of it. I don't understand how the folks who are running the country don't get the political resistance that is beginning to appear there. People don't like this.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, I'd like us to shift now, put our attention directly on your article, New Biden Climate Policies May Face Strong Legal Headwinds, published April 23 in Real Clear Energy. And it's one that I've wanted to talk with you about ever since I first saw it back then. So thank you so much for joining us to talk about it tonight. In that, you say that although the United States, under Biden's presidency, is rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, the ability of the Biden administration to discharge its obligations under that pact, treaty as I think it really is, but was never submitted to Congress, should have been, are heavily circumscribed. Even though Democrats controlled both houses of Congress during the Obama administration, they couldn't get through cap and trade or any other substantial climate change related legislation. And now they have a far less firm control of Congress. They barely control the Senate, 50-50 plus, with a vice president tiebreaker. And they have a very narrow margin in the House. So that's going to make the politics really tough. But you also point out that the science, coupled with what you're calling the indeterminacy of court deference doctrines under the Administrative Procedure Act, is going to defeat an awful lot of agency action under the Biden administration. Yeah. Let's pull those two things apart for a moment. The science, tell us what's been happening in the science that leads away from the Paris Climate Agreement, away from the EPA's CO2 endangerment finding from back in 2009, and away from the Supreme Court ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA back in 2007 that could result in sort of upending the whole thing. What's going on in the science?
Well, what's going on is very peculiar. As you know, it's warmed up about 1 degree Celsius since 1900. There were two warmings. One occurred from 1910 to 1945. That was about 0.5 degree Celsius. People couldn't have had very much to do with that. We hadn't put enough CO2 in the air in 1910 to provoke 0.5 degree of warming. I mean, if the tiny amount that we had put in by 1910 caused that much warming, it would be so hot right now we wouldn't be talking about this. And then there's another warming that begins around late 1970s and either ends in the late 1990s or becomes substantially reduced for about 12 to 14 years when it was supposed to be going up like crazy. All these things add up to the conclusion that the warming you're seeing is below the low end of the range of climate models that is used by folks like the United Nations or the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And so therefore the issue becomes less urgent. But at the same time, I think we can switch over to the politics here for a second. At the same time, the Obama administration and now the Biden administration had a lot of political support, they thought, for these very interventionist policies. So the Obama folks cooked up something called the Clean Power Plan, which was going to, first everybody thought it was okay because it was just going to switch over to natural gas, which produces, it is a very clean fuel, produces about half the carbon dioxide emissions per unit energy as you get for out of coal. But then they changed it. And the whole idea was it's all going to be replaced with solar energy and windmills. And that was much more intrusive. And when the Supreme Court had a look at this, they preempted it and said, you know, the chance that we're going to throw this out because it's not constitutional, there was never any legislation passed that could permit this huge activity. And the Supreme Court in 2014 warned the administration in a not too thinly veiled ruling that if they saw some nuance in some piece of old legislation that would have substantial economic effect, they'd better get some legislative backing for it. Otherwise, the court was going to look, as they said, very carefully at it. And that's what they did with the Clean Power Plan. Well, now you've got a bunch of radical environmentalists directing global warming policy in the administration. And they want to, for example, commit the United States to reducing our emissions by 2035 from the production of electricity to zero. I don't see how that happens. And I don't see how that happens without somebody withstanding who is impoverished by this, which would be like you and me and everybody else, going to court and saying, hey, where's the legislation for this? We don't have a king. We have 3 branches of government. And so I think that the pressures on the administration to act from the environmentalists and the fact that they will not get comprehensive legislation through in any form that I can see. Joe Manchin, Democrat senator from West Virginia, is not going to sit by and put all those West Virginia coal miners out of work. And they need his vote in order to pass anything because they only got 50 members of their party. They need every vote they can get. And so the chances that something serious legislative is going to happen, I think, is low. And the chance that the administration will overstep itself, will get its hand really slapped by the Supreme Court, I think is getting higher and higher and higher. We'll just have to watch.
Okay, so you've discussed a bit of the science. One thing I'd like to sort of feature on that for a moment, focus in on, is you mentioned how the actual observations of temperature change over time are getting farther and farther away from the global climate models, that on which the UN and the US GCRP rely. And I'd just like you to try to build on that a little bit. I believe our producer, Jim Moline, has a graphic that can illustrate that difference a little bit, if he's able to put it up shortly while you're talking. And you'll be able to see it and perhaps explain it a little bit for our other viewers. But I understand that whereas the last generation of these climate models overstated CO2's warming effect by anywhere from about 2 to 4 times, the new generation, the 6th generation, is even worse.
This is the weirdest thing. The more money you throw at this issue, the more uncertain and off kilter the science becomes. And, it's been pointed out in the 5th generation, the warmest models were about right around 4 degrees Celsius to the year 2100. They're way off. Doesn't matter. We get a new generation of models and they get hotter. And you can run these models backwards. You could say, well, what would, if you started this model in 1980, what would it show? And the disparity between the warm models and reality is striking. The hotter the model is, the worse it's off. How in the world does science, which knows it has a problem, over predicting the warming, create a new generation of models that are even worse than the previous one? It's like somebody's not living in the real world.
Yeah, I understand that out of a total medley of 124 different CMIP-5 models, the only one that pretty well matched actual observed temperatures, at least in terms of satellite observations and weather balloon observations and reanalyses, the only one that matched them pretty well was from Russia. Maybe
call
we
the
need
special
some
prosecutor.
Russia collusion. Maybe we need some Russia collusion on climate policy.
And you know what? That is the coldest of all those models. It has the least warming in it. And when it was rerun, the new fancy new version of it for Generation 6, it got even colder. What we call the equilibrium climate sensitivity, that's the amount of warming you should get for doubling CO2 after everything shakes out, was a little bit around 2.1 degrees Celsius in the previous version. Now it's down to 1.8. And, if you extend that out over the course of the 21st century, that's not going to produce very much warming at all. And it appears to be correct. At least they're going in the right direction. But the other models are not. And it's
if I were with, with the various fact checkers for Facebook or something like that, I would simply point out, hey, out of 124 models, 123 all say it's getting so much warmer. Why don't we just go with the majority?
Well, that's exactly what you shouldn't do. Pardon me?
What is unscientific about going with the majority of the models? Why pick the outlier?
Well, let's just take the example from weather forecasting. In day-to-day meteorology, we have, I think, about 7 or 8 different models. They all have different virtues and different problems. But you don't take all 8 models and average them up and say that's the forecast for tomorrow. No. You take the model, or maybe a couple models, that appear to be working really well, given what the current weather situation is, and you use those. Well, That's best scientific practice when it comes to forecasting. Best scientific practice when it comes to climate forecasting, as opposed to weather forecasting, would be to take the model that works, and that would be the Russian model. But no, we don't do that. We take the whole field of them, knowing full well they're over predicting. I guess because if you use the one that worked, the issue would go away, and my dear colleagues would have to fly in the back of the plane again, God forbid.
Yeah. So what you're basically saying is science follows evidence, not votes, right? And
It should.
it should. Yes, right. Real science, as opposed to some scientists, right?
The interesting
but
thing
this
is
is
that there
built
are
on.
the models that we're talking about are these so-called general circulation models, now called Earth system models.
Yeah.
They're very complicated things when a lot of values in them just have to be guessed, literally. And the word has come out now that the guessing is not a random thing. It turns out that modelers know an answer they want to get, and you can fiddle. I mean, there's like 100 different parameters you can fiddle with on these models to get the answer that you want. A paper was written a couple years ago called "The Art and Science of Climate Model Tuning."
Yes.
And in it, the author admitted, or he said, we can see changing a parameter to keep the results in the quote. These are the words of scientists: the anticipated acceptable range. In other words, it's not the science, it's the scientist that decides what the right global warming answer is. That is bizarre, and I did not realize. I knew the process. I had suspected it was because I can watch these models closely, but I didn't realize that every model, every last one of them, is tuned to give an answer. So when all the models say the same thing, it's not because knowledge has increased very much. It's because everybody thinks that's the answer we want to get, and nobody wants to stick out in the crowd. There's a model from the Max Planck Institute in Germany that, in its latest iteration, gave a 7 degrees Celsius warming, and the guys who ran it said we had to get that down. It was such an outlier that they fiddled with it until they got it down into the 3 to 4 degrees C range, so it didn't stand out. I mean, this doesn't sound like science to me, Cal. It sounds like, you're pushing a number machine to get an answer that you want and making sure that it doesn't give an answer that you don't want.
Yeah. Pat, I know that you are a scientist who does follow the evidence.
I do.
I just want to take a quick opportunity here to toss in a little recommendation for biblical foundations for scientific method. In 1 Thessalonians 5:21, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Test everything, hold fast what is good." And as I see it, that kind of mentality lies at the root of scientific method. It says, look, you got an idea, you got a hypothesis, wonderful, that's great. Now test it. Make the predictions based on it. Compare the predictions with observed reality. And if they contradict it, you're wrong. I mean, that's all there is to it. That of course, is a paraphrase of what the late Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman said about the key to science. And what we're seeing now is so many scientists just leaving science itself behind in order to pursue a particular political objective.
Well, that's unfortunate, but when you think about it, for an area like climate science, we only have one provider of funding, and that's Washington, D.C. And that funding doesn't come out of the Congress with no strings attached. I think it's generally assumed that we're going to give you all this money because it's a problem, right? So don't tell us it's not.
Yeah. In just a minute, I'm going to want us to turn to talking about, as you put it, the indeterminacy of court deference doctrines under the Administrative Procedure Act that could defeat Biden's agenda on this. But before that, I just want to remind our viewers that during the month of June, as our way of saying thank you, when you make a 100% tax deductible gift of literally any size, no matter how large or small, we would love to send you a free copy of this book, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth, by Jim Hollingsworth. Short chapters, very clearly and concisely written, 48 different chapters, answering various different questions about climate change in a way that anybody with a 10th grade education can grasp and then repeat to others to improve the public debate about this issue. So to request your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, write in promo code 21-06, that's 21-06, or the title, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. Be sure to include that part of the title, A Convenient Truth, because we have some other products that start with the name Climate Change as well. We want to be sure that we send you what you request. Be sure to get your request in by the end of June. After that, this offer ends. And this also lasts as long as our supply lasts. So if we run out, I'm sorry, we won't be able to send this to you. But that means the faster you act, the more sure you can be of receiving a copy of this book. So back now to Patrick Michaels, Dr. Patrick Michaels. He is a veteran climatologist. He's with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, former professor of environmental science, research professor at the University of Virginia, one of the most widely published scholars in this field, at least until the cancel culture took over much of the publishing in climate-related journals, and now anybody with Pat's perspective tends to just simply get crowded out of those journals. But I remember a wonderful article that you and my good friend Ross McKittrick did back in, I think it was 2003 or might have been 2004, that estimated that roughly half. Pardon?
This was the one on inherent errors in the temperature records.
Yeah, and part of the conclusion of that was that roughly half of the increase in global average temperature observed since the 1970s, or maybe it was 1960, could be attributed entirely to urban heat island effect that you and I talked about a little while ago. Great article, and unfortunately too many people are not aware of that, and so they'll say, okay, so what we see is, about half a degree of warming since 1960 or thereabouts. That, if that continues for a long time, we could have big problems. But it's, half of it's urban heat island effect, which simply is not global and is not a serious risk to anybody because we adapt, as we talked about before. Okay, now let's turn our focus to your reference to the indeterminacy of court deference doctrines under the Administrative Procedure Act and the obstacle that this creates to the bureaucratic agency implementation of Joe Biden's climate agenda over the next 3.5 years of his term in office. Explain what you mean by the indeterminacy of court deference doctrines.
Well, traditionally, the courts defer to federal technical agencies, and particularly in matters, that are very technical and scientific. They say, well, your judgment must be fine. That is beginning to change because, was it Justice Potter Stewart defined obscenity? Said he didn't know what it was, but when he saw it, he knew it. There are things going on in the science, like this pushing of the models to give a certain answer, that justices looking at this will say, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't be deferring to these agencies when they do things that are obviously incorrect. And Justice Scalia was a leader on this, but now Justice Thomas is issuing dissents and opinions in which he's questioning administrative deference by the courts And I know there's going to be a big global warming case come up quite soon. It's going to be interesting to see how Kavanaugh and Barrett vote on it. But Chevron deference, which is what it's called, has to do with a case called Chevron Petroleum versus somebody or other. That is on increasingly thin ice, and we're going to watch this spot, especially if, like an administration that we have now, is going to try and push expensive policies without legislative approval. Things could get pretty hairy pretty quick.
Yeah, and one of the things that you expect, and you also hope for, I'm quite sure, is that there could actually be a serious and maybe a successful challenge to what is referred to as the EPA's CO2 endangerment finding, reached back in 2009. Explain to us how that endangerment finding came about, how it was related to a Supreme Court case, Massachusetts versus EPA, how the Supreme Court's definition of air pollution in that decision is utterly bonkers, and really formed the basis of the giving the EPA the go-ahead to do an endangerment finding about CO2.
That's right.
And what has
that
happened
was required.
That causes that indicates that the Mass v. EPA decision and the endangerment finding were both wrong, and therefore the whole basis of all federal regulation of CO2 emissions disappears.
Well, of course, here in Washington, you hear rumors all the time about the court thinks this and the court thinks that. And one of them that keeps going around is the court's really not happy about Mass v. EPA and would like to revisit it, which would mean probably something for the endangerment finding. I think that, the disparity between the models and reality, and the fact that the models are now shown to be subjective rather than objective and have goals in mind, that puts the endangerment finding in a really dangerous place. And, one of these days there's going to be a case come up where it's going to come into question. How soon, I do not know.
That's partly because the EPA did not do what the Clean Air Act actually requires it to do, which was to conduct its own scientific assessment, rather than depending on other scientific assessments, whether by the Department of the Interior or NASA or NOAA or the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or anything else.
Yep.
The EPA simply depended on assessments done by those organizations, but all of those assessments in turn were based in the global climate models, whose depiction of climate warming was so far off from the real world observations.
All this is true. And, again, the more an administration tries to press on this without legislative approval, the more dangerous it becomes for the endangerment finding itself. I can't tell you exactly what case is going to come up, but I've heard a couple that are working their way through the courts. So we may get a look at this during this administration.
Yeah. Did want to just mention briefly, and I have to paraphrase here because I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but I remember that one of the really crazy things about the Supreme Court's decision in Mass v. EPA was where they actually tried to define what an air pollutant was. And in essence, it was anything that gets suspended in the atmosphere. So, you could include a bird feather as it falls off the bird. You could include the whole bird as it flies through the atmosphere. You can include clouds. You can include all the different gases that compose the atmosphere. And by defining an air pollutant that way, they were able to put CO2 under the category of air pollutant, which then let the EPA regulate it under the Clean Air Act, even though the Clean Air Act had an actual section that specifically said this act is not intended to empower the EPA or any federal agency to regulate carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that's unfortunately the way it worked. And, it's really odd to go after carbon dioxide as a pollutant because it's required for plant food. As you know, the Earth is getting greener and greener and greener. You can see it,
Yeah.
satellite data over decades now. And by the way, just as a matter of providence in a way, the place on Earth that's getting the greenest are the tropical rainforests, the ecosystems that everybody's so concerned about. They're greening up more than any other place on the planet. And this trend is not going to stop. So it's kind of hard to call that a pollutant. What's causing the Earth to become, an increasingly verdant, vibrant place?
Yeah, when every time a person exhales,
There's
he or
that.
she is exhaling 40,000 parts per million CO2, which is 100 times the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere as a whole. I mean, what that means is
Yeah.
that all of us are polluting just simply by exhaling. I think there's something fundamentally anti-human about that.
It's very strange, but the logic that our friends make could be tortured enough to make some sense. In other words, you put CO2 in the air and it warms up. It warms the temperature, and so therefore the sea level rises a little bit, and therefore you lose a little bit of land. That's, by the way, the basis for the case in Mass v. EPA. I don't know if you know that. It's that
Yeah.
Massachusetts was claiming that the sea level rise was eating, a few inches of its property, and that's where the case went. But you can make the argument, oh, this is bad, and so therefore it's a stretch to call it a pollutant, but it is a cause of something that takes away property. I would say it's also a cause of something that extends life and makes this a better place. But what do I know?
Yeah, well, you and I have a mutual friend in Dr. Craig Idso of the
Oh yeah, he's great.
CO2, CO2science.org, the Center for the
Yeah,
Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. And Craig published a study, a meta study back in, I think it was 2013, on the impact of heightened CO2 in the atmosphere on global agricultural yields.
oh
And he
yeah,
concluded in that study that from 1960 to 2012, just the CO2 that we'd added to the atmosphere, nobody had to pay anything extra to do that, right? It was all free. Uh, Added about $3.2 trillion worth of agricultural yield to the world's crops. And if you forecast over the next 38 years to 2050, how much more CO2 we were expecting to add to the atmosphere by then, you would be able to calculate that we would add another $9.8 trillion worth of food around the world
yeah,
just from more CO2. So you've got the warming of all the natural plants all over the place, the rainforests, the shrinking of deserts, the greening of the Sahel and places like that. And then you've got the increased agricultural yield. I mean, this is more food for everything that eats plants and more food for everything that eats things that eat plants. I mean, that seems to me like a win-win situation.
yeah. One of the stunning things you can do is you can go to the Food and Agricultural Organization and plot up history of the productivity of, say, the world's four main crops. Soybeans, corn, wheat, and rice. And the increase is a low order exponent, the opposite of what Malthus said. He said
Mm-hmm.
population would grow exponentially, but the food supply would grow linearly, and so therefore we'd all eventually starve. Well, it's the other way around. The food supply is actually growing exponentially, and the population in the developed world isn't growing very, very much at all. But if you plot it out for the last several decades, the increase in productivity is so smooth as to be uncanny. Generally it is assumed that when the crop yields or productivity deviates a great deal from, say, the previous year, after allowing for the amount of acreage that's planted, that's a weather effect. And so if there were a cumulative climate effect occurring on those yields, you would see that exponential increase beginning to damp off some. But it is the same exponent it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, just keeps on going up. And, it's in part, it's because of CO2, but otherwise, it's because as agriculture becomes more diversified and spreads, it becomes more stable around the world. In grad school, the project that I was on, we were funded to see if there could actually be a world food crisis. Could the world's weather systems conspire in a way that would cause that? And the answer, Cal, was no. And we searched for it and searched for it and searched for it and just couldn't find it.
Yeah, I remember reading in one of the books on economic history that the last naturally driven famine in the world was the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. That the only famines that have occurred since then have been driven primarily by politics, particularly by international and civil wars.
Yeah.
Famine as a natural occurrence is just simply a thing of the past, unless, of course, we rob ourselves of the very tools that have enabled us to defeat natural famine. Tools like the vast amounts of energy necessary to run the farm implements that allow one farmer to feed himself and 100 other people. Things like fertilizer made from natural gas and oil. Things like the pesticides and the herbicides that increase crop yields so much. It's only
the other thing that,
go ahead.
The other thing that is important on this, and it's been occurring at really exponentially increasing rates, is the actual genetic manipulation of crops, like Roundup ready varieties, Roundup resistant varieties, creates agriculture that is much easier on the earth because the no-till culture doesn't expose the soil. It's remarkable what has happened in agricultural science. It's actually a very exciting area to read about.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. Another topic that you address in your article in Real Clear Energy, New Biden Climate Policies May Face Strong Legal Headwinds, is the social cost of carbon. Tell us what that means, and then tell us a little bit about the various different studies that have tried to put numbers on that, and what happens to those findings, so to speak, if we actually begin to include the benefits of warming and the benefits of added CO2 in the atmosphere.
Well, the social cost of carbon actually should be called the social cost of carbon dioxide. That was cooked up first in the Obama administration, and it's a complicated calculation to determine, what a ton of carbon dioxide costs. And the idea here is you put a ton of CO2 in the air and it warms the atmosphere up a little bit, and this is a bad thing. And, if people's future, if the economy isn't super vibrant, well, that could create net losses of money. Well, it turns out first of all, this starts with a climate model. I mean, where do you want to go from there? It starts off with bad data, and then you assume things about how the economy will grow or stagnate in the future. And there are three of these mega models that are used. One of them, only one of them, allows for the planet to green up and agriculture to flourish. And we, Ross McKittrick, by the way, the same great guy you were just talking about before, and Kevin Dairatna from Heritage, looked at the social cost of carbon and put in more realistic numbers for greening. The numbers that were in the model weren't strong enough. And when we put those in and used models that mimicked what you got out of that Russian model, meaning a model that worked, the social cost of carbon went negative every time, meaning it was a benefit.
Which means?
A benefit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. This is when you want to be negative because positive is bad, right?
Yeah. So that's money that comes out of your pocket, but if it's negative, that's money going in the other direction. And we found that to be a general property as long as the sensitivity to temperature was not super high and the agricultural fertilization was what it seems to be. We think it's still negative and is going to be negative at least well into the latter half of this century. And, who knows what our energy stream is going to be like in the year 2100. I don't. Anybody who says they do, I don't trust, because 100 years ago, if I told you that just 100 years ago that, we'd fly around in machines at 600 miles an hour with a little box in our pocket that could access all the information in the world, you'd say I was nuts. But that's what happened in 100 years.
Yeah. And innovation is happening faster now than it did in those 100 years. I mean, we've got exponential growth in the rate of technological innovation. And it's that technological innovation that enables us to overcome problems, to adapt to problems. Right back to what we were talking about early on in the program is adaptation. And one of the worst things about the UN climate assessment reports is that they downplay adaptation as a response to man-made global warming, and they try to push for almost entirely mitigation. What do we do to try to reduce that warming? Well, if you're in a room and it's cold, it's a whole lot easier to put a sweater on than to cool the whole room. Now, if there are a bunch of you people in there, you maybe don't want to have a bunch of sweaters put on. Maybe you don't have the sweaters available, so you can cool that room. But if you're in, the world, and the world is getting a little warmer, it's a whole lot cheaper for us to adapt by putting a sweater on, by cooling our homes and our workplaces and so on, than it is by trying to control the temperature of the entire planet. So this fixation on mitigation instead of adaptation is just contrary to the whole history of humankind, and I think
that is true.
Rooted in it's rooted in the fidelity to the models, all the ones that get the wrong answers, and the repudiation of the one that gets pretty well right answers. And that in turn, I think, is flowing out of a political agenda, a cultural agenda that is in many ways fundamentally anti-human, that would love to see human population diminish. I mean, the top leaders of many of the world's top environmental organizations have said over and over again over the last 50 years, optimal human population might be, maybe 500 million people. Instead of the roughly 5 billion people we have right now. And so if you deprive people of the energy necessary for them to adapt to the natural world around them, you're going to return life to what Thomas Hobbes described as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's how you.
But you know what?
That's how you reduce populations.
Before we wind this up, I have to just bring us into the world of the absurd. Okay, let's say those thermometers are right, and it's warmed up a degree Celsius between 1900 and now. In the developed world,
can I interrupt you for just a second there, Pat?
Yeah.
And remember, what you're talking about there is 1 degree Celsius of global average temperature, which absolutely nobody and no
Consents.
ecosystem experiences. We experience local temperatures. And in local temperatures, we routinely go, 20, 30, 40 degrees change between
Sure.
nighttime low and daytime high, and 50, 60, 100 degrees change between winter low and summer high. So 1 degree change in global average temperature, nobody experiences it. What difference does it make, to quote a former politician we
Yes,
all
a
know?
former first lady or something like that. But the fact of the matter is that it's gone up 1 degree. Life expectancy doubled in the developed world. Per capita wealth increased 12-fold since 1900. And yet we hear that if it warms up another half a degree, this is all going to go away. That's nuts, okay? I mean, that's such an absurd contention that you have life expectancy doubling and wealth increasing dramatically as long as people are free. And if we just let it warm up a little bit more, that's all going to go away and we're going to go back to where it was in the 19th century. Who believes that? Well,
Well, unfortunately, too
I
many
mean,
people do believe it, but there's no scientific basis for it.
and there's no way it's not going to warm up another half a degree because the oceans have a pretty good thermal lag, and we're not going to stop emitting CO2. So, we're going to get to that dreaded 1.5 degrees of warming. Oh, did I mention that the United Nations says that every bit of warming that there is caused by human beings? Every last bit, including from 1910 to 1945. That's just wacko.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
and so
that's the
when
thing.
they
But
say the
what
Paris,
about what happened? What about what happened from, say, the 1690s, the low point of the Little Ice Age, to 1810? That
well,
obviously didn't come from CO2.
it
Uh,
warmed up about probably a degree and a half or
yeah,
so, and people were
yeah,
happy about it
you
because
bet. And it certainly cannot have been man-made. And so if you've got something happening in the past without a hypothetical cause, right, then the null
yeah,
hypothesis tells you that if the same thing happens later on, the burden of proof is on those who attribute it to a new cause, not to
yeah.
those on those who say, well, the old cause did it before, why couldn't it do it again?
No, I agree with you completely. So anyway, what else do we need to cover?
Well, what I want to do is just simply at this point to recommend that our listeners go and read your article. New Biden climate policies may face strong legal headwinds, because frankly, you get into a lot of technical details here that we just simply cannot discuss in a program like this. It would take us hours to really go through it all
Yeah,
in any great depth. But it's a brilliant article. I think it's a very encouraging article because, we
well,
all
thank you.
know that the Biden administration is committed to reducing human emissions of CO2 by aiming for net zero by 2050,
20,
aiming for a
2050.
50% cut in CO2 emissions by 2030. This kind of incredibly uh, uh, intense uh, agenda, goal
Well,
that
it's
that is
also
going to take
impossible.
a total revamp of the nation's and indeed much of the world's energy infrastructure that took 150 years to develop. And they want to change that in a very short time. So
Well,
that
2030 is
seems
only eight and a
discouraging. And
half years away. That's not
pardon?
very long. 2030 is only eight
No,
and a half years away.
that's right. Yeah. And the fact that the Democrats own Congress, the fact that in at least the lower courts, there still seems to be a lot of leaning in that direction. In those three branches of government, there seem to be problems, but you have brought together, I think, some very encouraging observations for those who've tended to feel a little bit discouraged in this battle for sanity
Yeah.
over climate and energy. I think your article will go far. Again, its title is New Biden Climate Policies May Face Strong Legal Headwinds, published in Real Clear Energy on April 23, 2021. Pat, thanks again so much for joining us tonight. Do you have a few closing words for us?
It's just always great to work with you. You got a good show, and I find you just one of the most broadly educated people I know. You must read a lot. I'll tell you that.
Always have done that. I mean, there's maybe 1/30th of my library behind me here,
Yeah, wow.
and so that could indicate. But I appreciate that. Now you do need to ward off accusations by confirming that we did not agree that I would pay you to say anything like that. In fact, you're not getting paid
That
anything
is
for
true.
this, right? All right. Pat, thanks so much. It's been a delight. I always enjoy consulting with you. You are just one of the best sources that I have. So thanks again. Have a great evening. If you hang
Thanks to
on
you too. Keep up the good work.
if you hang on a minute or two, maybe we can chat a little bit after we go off of live here. But I want to remind our listeners first that we are still offering the book Climate Change, A Convenient Truth, as our way of saying thank you when you ask for it, having made a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, just write in promo code 21-06 or the book title, the whole title, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. I think you'll really enjoy this. It's very short chapters, 48 of them, so it's a good substantial book, but they're written at a level such that anybody with a 10th grade education can understand them and then can use that understanding to help other people understand the same thing. The offer ends at the end of the end of June, or whenever we run out of our stock. And so I would encourage you to act quickly on this offer. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. Look forward to seeing you next week. And meanwhile, the Lord Jesus Christ and his grace be with you.